I realized my hair is not camera good, so I'm gonna go grab a hat. I'll be back in just a second. We can get going.
Before we started, Katie asked me, she was like, "You're wearing that shirt to record?" And I was like, "Yeah, why?" She was like, "Y'all do video, right?"
Oh my,
She's like,
brutal.
what's wrong with my shirt?
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the book!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club, where we are continuing our journey with The Dawn of Everything, a new history of humanity, written by the Davids, Graeber, and Wengrow. What did you talk about last time? It was about the Louisiana Poverty Point site. A lot of these North American sites on the eastern seaboard and in Florida, and some of those early societies. Today, we're talking about Chapter 5, which is titled Many Seasons Ago, Why Canadian Foragers Kept Slaves and Their Californian Neighbors Didn't, or the Problem with Modes of Production. And so I thought this chapter was really interesting for a number of reasons. It's also pretty local to you, Arthur. I feel like this is kind of your stomping grounds they're talking about in a lot of ways in this chapter. Some local indigenous history for you. I thought this concept that we had mentioned earlier in the book, they come back to schismogenesis, the way people define themselves against other groups in distinction to other groups. So they bring that back in this chapter in an important way and compare these two areas. Well, we're really talking about the western seaboard of North America, all the way from Alaska down through the middle of California, and how there were a couple of different types of indigenous civilizations that had formed in different areas. And so they're trying to understand, like the subtitle says, why Canadian foragers kept slaves and their California neighbors didn't. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We can talk about the concept of modes of production in general, which is the typical Marxist way of looking at society and looking at culture. What is the mode of production for a particular culture, and what does that say about how that society views things like the family, like social relations, like equality, and how the mode of production can sort of determine the values that a culture has. They come back to this argument that they make again and again, that people, regardless of how ancient we're talking about, make conscious political choices about the way their societies are formed. And so they try to give that agency its full humanity, regardless of whatever society they're talking about. But just to get started, I thought I could read a paragraph on page 170 at the end of this intro section, which kind of summarizes their argument for the chapter. And then we can kind of just branch out from there. I'm curious what moments from this chapter really resonated with you guys, what you thought was interesting or thought-provoking. I have a handful of things I can point to, but let me just start with this overall chapter argument from the authors and then see how you guys like this chapter. So they say on page 170, in this chapter we want to explore what actually did drive processes of cultural subdivision for the greater part of human history. Such processes are crucial to understanding how human freedoms, once taken for granted, eventually came to be lost. In doing this, we'll focus on the history of those non-agricultural peoples who inhabited the western coast of North America. As their refusal of agriculture implies, these processes were likely far more self-conscious than scholars usually imagine. In some cases, as we'll see, they appear to have involved explicit reflection and argument about the nature of freedom itself. So particularly with the California group, it seems like they actively rejected agriculture. Not just didn't know about it, but actively decided, no, not for us. What struck you guys right off the bat from this chapter as interesting?
I loved that, kind of went through these two different modalities of society here. We get like the classic northern Canadian province where there is hunting and fishing, and it turns into this hierarchical hour, not unlike what we see today in terms of mode of production, kind of relying on this. I guess there it's like slaves, and today we have internally to the US like wage laborers, but our society also works and, gets production from slavery. And then it had this this other one in defiance of it in this California area. And I just loved initially like this idea that combated kind of like in all these books that we've read, I think there's this like narrative we keep seeing creep up about like, capitalism is inevitable. It's because of this, it's like maybe it's Protestantism itself that leads to whatever. But this inherently like takes a stance against that. And it shows that people reject that. They had these pot latches that like were these feasts where they destroy like consumer goods and like all this excess to show like the defiance against that. And it was more of like this society where they had more moral values of production. So I just really love that idea of like challenging that capitalism isn't inevitable and these people actually thought about it and deliberately made that choice. So really insightful.
Yeah, I think the thing I like the most throughout the chapter, and I know this was kind of the point of the chapter too, but it goes back to the beginning of the book. I can't remember exactly what they said, but like how societies arrange themselves in all these different ways. Like there wasn't one way of doing a thing that everybody stuck to. And I think this really kind of exemplified that with, a northern aristocratic society that was developed with clear hierarchy, and then another more egalitarian one. And I think, I can't remember where the quote was, but it goes back to your point, Joe, about the schismogenesis, like the theory of these are always going to kind of develop in parallel because societies like instinctively are doing the opposite of their neighbors, or like tend to do that to differentiate themselves from their neighbors. It made me think like, yeah, all the parallels to where we are today, right? But the difference being, at that point, you're differentiating your tribe from the tribe that might be 40 miles away. And now we're creating these tribes online and differentiating ourselves from others that might be literally our neighbor next door, right? I just thought that was super interesting, like the way that kind of is playing out today, I guess, if you just take that theory and keep going with it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too. Yeah, it is more geographic in the past, but with the internet, it allows us to have these subdivisions all across the globe in different ways. Like you got anti-capitalists who define themselves in one way, and then fascists who define themselves another way, and they're all in the same location often. Yeah, it's messy. In this chapter, well, in the book in general, I like how these authors are taking their disciplines to task while they're writing. They're not just writing a book about the history of cultures and stuff. They're also investigating what other scholars have been saying and sort of picking out problems with that and pointing out issues in the disciplines, like why scholars tend to be reductive or dismissive about ancient cultures. And so they have all these random one-liners they drop that are just like kind of, I don't know, I'm tempted to say like catty interdisciplinary arguments back and forth or whatever. But one thing they say is on page 168, they're just talking about this idea of the notion that a society is a homogeneous unit, that a group of people is one thing, and you can kind of define it in that one thingness. And they say, arguably, the very idea that the world is divided into such homogeneous units, each with its own history, is largely a product of the modern nation state and the desire of each to claim for itself a deep territorial lineage. And so I feel like for me, that line is just like, people are complicated, human history is complicated, individual societies, small or large, are complicated and messy and all over the place. And when you try to reduce them to some single aspect, you're going to get reductive, you're going to dismiss important features about it. Because on the surface, just these two cultures that they're dealing with, the Canadians who were more aristocratic and had these potlatch festivals and exuberance wealth and a lot of hierarchy and a lot of like, well, they went back to show that their masks and their art had a lot to do with illusion and sort of outward appearances being fake in some way or performative in another way. And their California neighbors, much more egalitarian, much less showmanship, one-upmanship, a lot more focus on the inner life of developing, your personality, of developing your character, emphasis on work ethic. And it's just kind of interesting how these break down, because on some level, the Californian group seems to be more capitalist in the way we would think of it, because they use money, because there's individual ownership, there's private property, there's things like that. But they kind of pride themselves on their ability to take care of other people, on their, I think I even remember them saying that when it was a tradition in that society that when a person died, that all of their things were ritualistically burned, so there's no hereditary passing down of wealth. Your kids don't get all the things you accumulated. It's sort of burned when it goes away. And so it just doesn't line up in the ways that we would expect it to, and it's confusing. And they sort of use this confusion to make all these interesting points. But we could talk about the slavery aspect at a certain point. Why did the Canadians keep slaves, and why did the Californians not have slaves? And what did that have to do with how these groups define themselves against each other?
Before I think one thing I wanted to mention, Joe, you're talking about how like the more capitalist society or what we would see as a more capitalist society. Like I think one of the things they talked about was what people do when they get that excess of wealth and how that differed, right, between the tribes, and like the ones that, would, and how like they almost had like the differing potlucks. Like one was like more competitive aristocrat, like let's, like show each other up. And the other one's more like, let's put on this, massive like celebration for everybody else with this wealth that we've attained. And it made me think of, this might not be a real accurate comparison, but at least the story that we've been told about, I can't remember the exact time frame this would be. It would be like the 1920s, when industrialists in the US would spend a lot of their excess money building museums and building like, these things for people to go to and like would benefit society. It made me kind of think about that versus today, where it's like Elon Musk is just gunning to be the first trillionaire, right? Like it's like, so it was kind of funny. Like maybe we've seen examples of both of these things in our society, and we're moving more towards that like aristocratic, hey, who gets to be the first billionaire to launch a spaceship to the moon, instead of like, let's build a new park and, give that to everybody for enjoyment. But anyway, that was something that stuck out to me.
Yeah, there's a connection with philanthropy here, like for sure. This, I don't know, I've always been kind of skeptical of philanthropists because it's just seems to me like a really wealthy person's way of being like, look how much I care about people. It's like a self-image control kind of thing. And it makes sense along the lines that you're saying, because like with a lot of these leaders in indigenous groups, if they had a lot of wealth, they needed to treat the common people a certain way in order to hold on to that status. If they started acting like dickheads, people would ignore them, leave them, go away, whatever. That was part of the reason why they give in the book why the Canadians started capturing others for slave labor, is because they couldn't control their own commoners enough to do the labor that they wanted done for them. And so they had to start capturing other people to do the labor. It does seem like the uber wealthy these days care less and less about what the average person thinks of them. They're perfectly happy being hated by everyone, I guess. I don't know. Elon Musk seems pretty miserable, but it seems like someone like Peter Thiel doesn't give a shit that everybody hates him. He's perfectly happy carrying on with his evil business anyway. Yeah, that's an interesting take.
Yeah, that is, I'd never connected, like the philanthropy aspect is really interesting. It made me think about like, and it's like, there should be a website where you go to and you see these billionaires and you can see like how much they should have paid in taxes and they've evaded versus like what percentage they've given to philanthropy, and like see what they really owe.
And that should be on big billboards all over the place.
That would be sick. Yes.
And Joe, to your point
Yeah.
there about like, it's kind of like a PR thing, right? It's doing philanthropy to do your image. Do you think that's what has ingrained this thought into a lot of us, that like, oh, businessmen are doing the good thing, like looking up towards like, you know what I mean? Like that's definitely a prevailing thing. Like everyone, was talking about, oh, well, we need a businessman to be the president because they know how to be successful. Like, do you think that comes from like, back when they were actually like creating museums or philanthropic things, like actually creating good things for people, right? Is it just all public relations, which you always need to tie that back to propaganda because public relations is propaganda. But anyway, like, that's
Yeah, for sure. It's part of the whole American myth process. I'm going through the 1800s in A People's History of the United States with my students now, and there's a moment in one of the chapters after the Civil War where Howard Zinn had listed all these big American names like Rockefeller and Gould and Carnegie and all these people who are some of the philanthropists that you might be thinking of from the Gilded Age. All of them avoided all the military service. They paid for substitutes in all these major conflicts and stuff. And it's just funny to always point that out. Like, the wealthy people are never going to actually put their bodies on the line, but they'll demand that poor people put their bodies on the line for them. But meanwhile, here's a museum, here's some books, look how generous I am. Just kind of funny when you look at it that way. I actually laughed out loud a little bit reading this paragraph at the bottom of 178 about capitalism because of the way that they described it. I thought I could just read that because it speaks to some of the roots of capitalism and puts it in a frame that maybe people don't often think about. So they're sort of glossing Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism essay, in which he tries to explain why capitalism began in Western Europe and not anywhere else. And so this paragraph at the bottom of 178, they say, capitalism, on the other hand, involved constant reinvestment, turning one's wealth into an engine for creating ever more wealth, increasing production, expanding operations, and so forth. But imagine, Weber suggested, being the very first person in one's community to act this way. So, like, being the very first person to be like, hey, you're accumulating all this stuff, you're doing so good, you're getting all this stuff. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to turn it into something good for the community? He's like, nah, I'm just going to turn it into more shit for me. More shit for me. More shit for me.
That's funny.
Just imagining the first person to act that way. That line had me cracking up.
No, this is for
it's
sale.
so absurd.
Yeah. You can buy this. I wonder what, like, the first money then was. You can buy this with what? These tokens I made.
It's like script. This guy's like inventing capitalism script at the same time. They're connected.
Lots of interesting parallels to the ancient Greeks here, too, when they're talking about schismogenesis and just sort of the different slave societies and everything. They use Athens and Sparta as good examples of schismogenesis, societies that were very close to each other, obviously knew about each other, and were obviously extremely different in so many different ways. And so that I thought that was a useful comparative framework for thinking about these two indigenous groups. Obviously, they knew about each other. And as we go through the chapter, we see that in that Northern California area, in between the two groups, they talk about where it seems like societies that had moved from the Canadian areas down to California had actively, and there's even legends that they read about it, like have these stories and legends, these no-no stories about don't be the kind of people that take slaves and dominate other people. That's bad for you. So I don't know. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
I really liked that parable. It was like the Wogies or something in modern day Oregon. And they were like these artisans. And I really identified with them. I was like, oh no. And then, yeah, they got captured. And it was just, yeah, that was really, really good parable there.
If we wanted to jump into the next, like the slavery piece of it, I actually did highlight quite a bit of page 185. I don't know if you guys also did that. There was like a couple paragraphs in there that I thought were really interesting. And this actually, so I'll just read these two, but this comes after talking about like the differences between the potlatch, between the two Californian tribes versus the Northwest Coast tribes, and trying to talk about the major differences. So I'm going into this, it's the second paragraph on page 185. So we're talking about the same basic institution, a redistributive Jesus, feast carried out in an entirely different spirit, or two entirely different institutions, or even potlatch and anti-potlatch. How are we to tell? Clearly, the issue is much broader and touches on the very nature of culture areas and what constitutes a threshold or boundary between them. We're looking for a key to this problem. It lies in the institution of slavery, which, as we've noted, was endemic on the Northwest Coast, but correspondingly absent south of the Klamath River. Am I saying that right?
Well, the modern white people say Klamath. I don't know if that's accurate at all. But we used to play Klamath Falls in high school, so that's however we used to say it.
Perfect. Okay, so the Klamath River in California. Slaves on the Northwest Coast were hewers of wood and drawers of water, but they were especially involved in the mass harvesting, cleaning, and processing of salmon and other adronomous fish. There's no consensus, however, on how far back the indigenous practice of slavery actually went. The first European accounts of the region in the late 18th century speak of slaves and express mild surprise in doing so, since full-fledged chattel slavery was quite unusual in other parts of Aboriginal North America. These accounts suggest that perhaps a quarter of indigenous Northwest Coast population lived in bondage, which is about equivalent to proportions found in the Roman Empire or classical Athens, or indeed the cotton plantations of American South. What's more, slavery on the Northwest Coast was a hereditary status. If you were a slave, your children were also fated to be so. So I just thought that was like kind of a really interesting way to jump into that, and the fact that they assumed, or think it was around the same amount that was like in the South. Like it's just like this thing that I guess no direct connection there, and yet ended up being very similar, right? Like to what was going on in Roman Athens, or not a connection that we could draw back, but yeah, I just thought that was interesting in the comparison to the American South and also the capitalist society, right? Because they had Joe, this is what you were talking about earlier, right? That was the same tribe that basically couldn't get their own populace to be enough labor force for them, so they had to war and bring in all of these people to basically do the labor for them in order to have that surplus, right?
Yeah, and it was like I think it's important, just like what you're reading here is just like underscoring how much this was a slave society. It wasn't just like, oh, they, there are a bunch of different ways that societies have had slaves, but this was like a full-fledged chattel slavery society with like you're saying, a quarter of the population in bondage. And they bring in the idea of modes of production to explain why, right? The way people get their food in the Canadian society versus the Californian society is the Canadians rely heavily on fish. And fish as a commodity is very front-ended, labor-intensive. As soon as you catch it, you have to process it and eat it or preserve it, dry it. It's very labor-intensive right off the bat. The Californians were more on like acorns and pine nuts and shit. So you can collect them very calmly, leisurely, keep them in storage, and they're labor intensive when you want to use them, but they'll stay good for a long time until you use them. And so they use this to explain why the aristocrats in the Canadian society needed some solution to the labor intensive problem. So they, for the fisheries, when the fish are in season and they need to catch all these fish and process it and everything and turn them into oils or preserve them, yada, yada, the aristocrats in the Canadian society, they didn't want to do the work, right? They wanted other people to do it for them. And when they leaned too heavily on the common people to do that work, the common people were like, oh, you're just a small family house. I'll just ignore you and go live in this other area with these other aristocrats who are slightly less mean to me. And so they couldn't control the labor force that way. And I think that's how these authors are kind of theorizing where the impetus in the society for slavery came from. It's like, oh, we depend on these fish. We're not going to do the work. So let's become a capturing society and enslave people for that reason.
Well, and then just like, thinking parallels to today, right? Like, what do we have in the U.S. that forces people to work? It's the lack of health care unless you have a job, right? Like your employer will take care of you by giving you health care, but we're not doing anything from the government to do that, right? Because it disincentivizes the labor market. Or you could also say Americans don't want to do jobs that pay them very little to labor for long hours in fields. So we bring in people from, Latin America to do that for them. Right. It's very similar, obviously not, textbook definition of slavery and your children will be slaves, but, wage slavery, I guess.
No, and yeah, wage slavery is very legitimate, basic concept that Marxists use all the time. Like, I think the way that Marx had put it was, well, I can't remember the phrase, but it's essentially, if you had a choice not to work, then you have a choice not to work, but the choice isn't like work or something else. The choice is work or starving to death. And so if that's the only option you got, it's still just as effective as slavery as a mechanism of control, and that people are going to show up to work because they have no other options, because you've set it up that way. I think that's essentially what wage slavery is. Oh, the question I wanted to ask, since we're talking about schismogenesis and how societies define themselves, and I think it's useful for us to have these back and forth conversations about what's going on in the book and the history, and then how that relates to the world we see today. I think that's the usefulness in studying history in general, is just to keep those connections alive. So as a U.S. culture, what kind of refusals or what kind of antagonism do we use to define ourselves? I wanted to propose that maybe U.S. culture is defined against mutual aid and mutual care. What do you guys think? How is U.S. culture defined in a schismogenesis kind of way? What sorts of identities do we actively reject as part of our identity, if we're thinking about U.S. culture that way?
Well, I think the big one that sticks out to me is individualism, right? More about the individual freedom, right, is what we keep saying or talking about. And you as a person watching out for yourself, taking care of yourself, and less on reliance on your community or those around you or services, right? Like we very much like to talk about how, anything you receive is an entitlement in a negative fashion, or it's
Handout.
welfare. Yeah, it's handouts, right? Like, so I think that's a big part of it. And then like, have you guys seen like Europores? Like that's a pretty common thing that people say, like making fun of Europe because they don't have money or something like that. So like define ourselves through wealth as well, just as American society writ large, right? Like we're gonna grind hard, we're gonna work a ton. Like there's a thing about working like 80-hour weeks, right? Like people are excited to talk about that. Those are kind of the things that pop up into my head if I had to define what Americans or tend to promote that wouldn't necessarily be seen the same way in other cultures. Like more specifically on that piece, my wife and I were on vacation and we happened to meet up with a bunch of Australians on this one thing that we were doing. And they were talking about how they were on a month-long trip to the United States. And we were like, oh, wow, that's awesome. Like and talked a little bit more about that. And that's just a yearly thing, like a month-long vacation. Like that's a common cultural thing for them. And I'm just thinking back to like the US. I'm like, oh man, if you get 2 weeks, you're pretty lucky, like 2 weeks in a row sometimes.
Yeah, I guess I thought originally, like internally in the US, I thought about like subgroups like pop versus punk. But as like a nation, I guess like internally our politics certainly do this where like the Republican Party defines itself as like, law and order because they see the other party as not that. And the Democrats define themselves as like the defenders of freedom because they see the other people as highly controlling and vice versa. And then I thought about consumerism and how, like in the US, there's this cultural value. I guess it's like virtue signaling of like, it's like, I'm not like the people who shop at insert whatever place here, it's like, I'm more like whatever. So you define your value system of consumption through like the like not buying into certain things. Like I'm not going to go to Starbucks where they're on, they're striking, whatever. And yeah, so I guess I thought about that kind of rejection stuff. And as a myth too, like America, I guess if we get into like the daddy and the new world myth, like we kind of reject the old world of like monarchy and hierarchy still embedded in this obviously hierarchical system, but like we reject that kind of like tradition of kings.
Yeah, I think it's hard to define in a lot of ways, and part of that is, and maybe this is conspiracy theory territory, but it's just trying to understand how the system works. They talk a lot about subdivision and schismogenesis in this chapter, and of how it can, I don't know, geometrically, I kind of imagine a fractal pattern. You can sort of zoom out or zoom in on the fractal pattern to get different subdivisions of society, of culture, even down to a neighborhood unit or even inside an individual family. There's schismogenesis. I'm the brother that reads books. I'm not the brother that plays video games, or what, you sort of define yourself against your siblings in some ways. But within U.S. culture, it felt sinister to me because there are all these ways, some of which you're alluding to, Arthur, that we have different practices of subdivision and schismogenesis, even down to sports teams. Like, how many different sports seasons do we have with different sports teams in each different type of sport, and how many rabid fans does each sports team have, and how willing are they to, like, growing up for me, it was like Duke versus Tar Heels or Clemson versus Carolina. And people were extremely serious about those differences, like extremely serious. It took up a lot of conversation time just in life in general. Um, but there are all these, I guess what's sinister to me about it is that this process that the authors are explaining of schismogenesis is an important part of human culture, and that it's the process by which we make conscious political choices as groups about how we want to be, how we want to define ourselves, what kind of lives we want to have. It was very serious for these Northern California groups to actively reject slavery, to actively reject agriculture, and to depend on certain forms of life. And what's sinister to me about U.S. culture in the modern period is that they've taken this serious process where we get to decide consciously, politically, how we want to be in the world, and they turn it into this frivolous game where it's just about sports or brands or companies. And I think all of that stuff just exhausts our energy for making actual, real, life-changing political choices together. You know, what if we took all this energy that we put into brand loyalty and sports team loyalty and all this stuff, and took all that energy and had a big conversation about what kind of society we actually want to have? I think there are strategic ways that the ruling class exhausts our mental energy for these kinds of conversations that makes it harder to have them. So that's kind of my conspiracy theory take on it.
I love that. I think the schismogenesis definitely, like, it's fed in American culture and they profit. Like, I guess when I was saying like pop versus punk, like there's profit there in the fashion industry and the movie industry, like whatever, and all these value systems. So that definitely makes sense to, like, you know, keep us tired, keep us apart, and you can't unify, you can't come together and make any changes for the select few that are making all the money.
I think that also just ties into like this promotion of individualism, right? Like you are, you know, you are unique. You're a special like snowflake. Well, I guess probably don't see that anymore, but anyway, you know, like you're a unique person, and you should be able to represent your style. And it just so happens that your style is, I don't know, Hollister. I'm going back to like high school brands here, right? Like your style's Hollister surfer guy, right? And then there's like happens to be 10 other people that are also that at your school, right? But anyway, there was that, but then there was something, Joe, you said there about the sports teams, and it made me think like, I don't know, even at like the high school level, right? Like there's always that for us, like growing up, it was Wells. Like the Wells team for some reason was like, oh, we're enemies with Wells. I knew nothing about Wells, right? Like all I knew about them was that they usually beat us in sports and they wore red and white. But like that was like a rivalry kind of build up there. And you said something about like it's your culture. There was a quote in here that I did want to read. It was talking about the Inuit and kind of like adopting different technologies from different civilizations. This was on page 175. But it said like the Inuit did not simply react with instinctual revulsion when they first encountered someone wearing snowshoes and then refused to change their minds. They reflected on what adopting or not adopting snowshoes might say about the kind of people they considered themselves to be. In fact, Mouse concluded it was precisely in comparing themselves with their neighbors that people came to think of themselves as distinct groups. And I was like, that felt like a connection back to like those, like, oh, I'm choosing to be a supporter of, you know, this sports team. Like I'm choosing to be a Maple Leaf supporter, and like that's a choice I'm making, right? And that's defining me against other people that, you know, are hockey fans or whatever. I don't actually like the Maple Leafs, but just that was the first one that popped into my head.
No, that's a good example too, the sports team thing, because even in conversations about sports and about fandom and stuff, you get into analysis about how people make their decisions. I enjoyed the Lakers as a basketball team growing up because I liked watching Kobe and Shaq play together, and that's how I started enjoying basketball. They also happened to be really good and won a lot, and so my brothers would accuse me of being a bandwagon fan. They're sort of criticizing the method that I use to make my sports team choice, as opposed to like home team loyalty. You're supposed to be devoted to this team because they're only 2 hours away as opposed to 20 hours away or whatever. So even within sports, it's a good example to talk about how people make these choices and how we're already aware of the fact that they are self-conscious choices that people make in different ways.
So something else I really thought was interesting from this chapter was how they kind of like defined slavery and how it was in, different societies, right? And like what that actually meant for those societies. This was on, I think, page 187. So they've been talking about slavery without defining the specific term. But one of the things down lower, it was talking about like Roman legionary was captured. So it was basically going back to the etymology of the word or where free came from. Like I didn't realize that was like kind of like a corresponding thing with friend, and like slavery in the context of like the old Roman, you literally couldn't have friends. You couldn't make obligations to people or have any personal relationships, to the point where, and this is where I'm going to just read from this, if a Roman legionary was captured in battle and enslaved, then managed to escape and return home, he had to go through an elaborate process of restoring all his social relationships, including remarrying his wife, since the act of enslaving him was considered to have severed all previous relationships. The West Indian sociologist Orlando Patterson referred to this condition of social death. I thought the concept of social death and the way that some of the indigenous tribes actually looked at it was like a state that you could be placed in for a while, like a state of suspension almost, and then like you could earn your way out of social death. But my reason for bringing this all up was, one, I found that interesting, but then it talks about how some in these, I think this was in the Amazonian society later on, it was talking about how, some were in this social death status and then could basically acclimatize to whatever culture and move out of that and become a member of society. And then some would be like basically put to death for like ritual sacrifice and like never leave that. But the next quote that it had on page 190, or it's not a quote, but what it says on 190, however, captives could sometimes be kept suspended in a social death as part of a permanent pool of victims awaiting their actual physical death. Typically, they would be killed at collective feasts akin to the Northwest Coast potlatch, presided over by ritual specialists, and this would sometimes result in the eating of enemy flesh. All this may seem exotic, however, it echoes the way exploited people everywhere and throughout history tend to feel about their situation. Their bosses or landlords or superiors are blood-sucking vampires, and they are treated at best as pets and at worst as cattle. And the reason that stuck out to me is because right now, like what we're starting to, I'm sure you guys have seen that, but there's been comparisons of like, well, some of the slaves didn't have it that bad. Like there were good slave owners in America, right? Like back in that, like kind of talking about that, but just the way it kind of laid it out here, like to the person that's actually being enslaved, it doesn't matter how well you're being treated, right? Like even if you're being treated as a pet or whatnot, like you're still being exploited by whatever this ownership class is. So anyway, that was a lot, but I was just interested in the concept of social death and how they could get out of it.
It's really cool. I was reading a book this past year by an Italian philosopher called Giorgio Agamben, and he talks about this concept of like homo sacer, which is kind of similar, where in Rome, they had these people that like could be cast out, but they couldn't be killed for sacrifice. They were just like sovereign in their own right. And it was just kind of this biopolitical point of like societies always define this like who can live, who can't live kind of, and this is kind of the exact same thing. And it's super interesting because today it's like, I think about the people taken by ICE or even exploited workers, gig workers, prisoners used for labor, which we always bring up. Yeah, there's always this like, you can't be killed, you can't live, and we're going to choose what freedoms you have. And that's really interesting that it's like a thing that gets baked in and it's continuously just needs to be reaffirmed, however they say it really elegantly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't read maybe 10 pages of Agamben, but there are a lot of people and a lot of professors I knew in grad school who were huge on Agamben.
That's why I
remember how to say his name.
It was actually like a grad school like teacher who like recommended it. So I picked it up and didn't read it until this last year.
But yeah, it's interesting to see how differently people conceptualize even the idea of slavery and what it meant and everything. Like you're saying, this idea of social death. But the underlying point being that like any kind of bondage is a fundamental refusal or stripping away for that person of their ability to make self-conscious political choices. Their will is not their own, in other words. And it's like the ultimate kind of unfreedom. And that's why you had these legends in the Northern Californian tribes who recognized the dangers of slavery. They viewed like the settler genocide as like a return of the repressed almost of those other white people, the wogies that they had treated poorly in the past or something.
Arthur, that comparison to like it's almost like the when we talk about prison slavery and prison labor, and essentially you go to prison, you're sentenced to a form of social death, right? And I mean, like you're either going to get through that and be rehabilitated and put back into society, or you're literally waiting for your physical death. So like social death and prison are synonymous almost, like the way that they talk about it there. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, so slavery in capitalism is built different though, with this idea of social death. Like a lot of these societies that we're talking about had like, I don't know, religious aspects to the concept or certain ceremonial aspects. And I'm going back to that idea of like, imagine being the first person in your community to just assist on accumulation, accumulation, accumulation. And so for some people in some of these societies, getting a bunch of slaves from another society that you raid meant that all of a sudden you have a bunch more free labor for caring for your children or preparing food or whatever. When a capitalist acquires a bunch of slaves, it's like, oh, accumulation just exponentially increased. And so the purpose of that is even more, I don't know, it seems more brutal in the accumulation framework than it is in just using these people for childcare labor or whatever, or prepping the fish this year or whatever they used them for. What made me think about that, Cody? You said that if a person gets incarcerated today, it's a form of social death, but then they can get rehabilitated and released and they can go back to society. When the capitalists are in control of the carceral system, they don't have an incentive to rehabilitate their free labor back into society where they would have to be paid a full living wage. They have an incentive to keep them not rehabilitated, so the recidivism rate is extremely high on purpose, so that the pool of free usable labor or very, very cheap labor remains high. I remember seeing a press conference from some Southern politician, maybe Louisiana or Alabama. They were talking about this release program. They were basically complaining that too many of the good prisoners were getting released and let back out into society. And it was like, these are the ones that we can use to wash our cars. And just openly at the press conference admitting that they're salty about the fact that they can't use these slaves anymore. And this was like, I don't know, 5 years ago or something.
Wow. Like, that's just like, oh man, the ones that have a good work ethic and don't get in trouble, man, why do they get out? Like, but then maybe the concept of social death in the way that they talk about it here with the societies that thought of it more as like you can come back into it is more like the way that some of the Nordic countries treat, prison. Like it's actually like a place where people go and can hopefully be rehabilitated to the point where they can enter back into society normally, not go and be exploited and likely further entrenched into that, I guess, cycle of back into prison, like you're saying.
Kind of interesting too that they talk about freedoms and these unfreedom cultures and how they kind of have to like perpetuate this ideology throughout their society, and how these like fisher kings get like they have to just perpetually take slaves and take slaves and take slaves for this like theatrical rule, and the other people in defiance or in opposition of that also have to like keep doing these things to keep their freedoms. And so I just thought that was really interesting going into like these societies themselves kind of got stuck when they kind of talk about like how they need the freedom to experiment with social order or whatever, but even that they get, I don't know, like tripped up on just getting stuck in the same like hierarchical position, I guess.
Do you think the scale helps with that? I mean, just thinking about the scale of the societies, even when they were like this Canadian society, even though it's like hierarchical and aristocratic and they keep slaves and they have these grotesque rituals where they're just pouring oil on their bodies and showing off all the goods that they've got their slaves to process this year or whatever. Even in that society, the scale is relatively small. It seemed like, I can't remember where, but they said each family clan maybe had like 200, 300 people under their control or something like that. Even though it's like stuck or hierarchical in that way, when it's that small, you can kind of run away if you get a chance and go somewhere else and, maybe you get caught, but chances are you can get away. In a society like this, they've got their boots stomping on 340 million people's necks right now with all this stuff they're trying to do. And like, I don't know, just the scale of the stuckness just seems so massive now compared to what we're talking about here.
It reminds me of like the conversation we had. I mean, one of the conversations, but Joe, you were talking about how institutions grow. Like they take on their own life essentially, right? And like when I guess we have a lot of institutions that, I mean, their express purpose is to grow and from like a revenue standpoint and continue to get bigger. Like that's literally the point of like the tech companies. Like that's like in their paperwork, right? To basically optimize shareholder returns, right? Which means ultimate growth. I guess, a few hundred years later, as these things continue to expand, I mean, is that just the natural, like where you get with that sort of thing, with that mindset of perpetual growth is the only way? Like, and I'm trying to relate this back to what you said, like you've got a society of 200 people, but I guess as this expands, the other thing was that it was talking about the shatter zone of California with like all these tons and tons of different, like a million different people up and down the coast, like tribes and whatnot. But like you're saying, now it's congealed. Now it's like these institutions overseeing all of it. So I don't know. I guess I'm wondering, do you think that plays a part into it over time? Like those things just getting bigger and bigger?
Yeah, I mean, that just makes me think about that line that we liked from one of the earlier chapters. A lot of indigenous people enjoyed play kings and real freedoms, while we have to make do with real kings and play freedoms. The trouble is when the play kings start to get too serious and not enough people push back on them, and they, start, like you're saying, they turn into an institution. Start out with just this 200-member family clan taking slaves and trying to control their little area, and then they captured another family and another family and another family. And that's the danger that I try to emphasize with the whole concept of the nation state and why the nation state itself, and this is the crucial anarchist point of view of why the nation state is dangerous, is because it creates a massive identity that is used to control a massive amount of people. Like Howard Zinn said, the creation of the United States in the Revolutionary War was an ingenious method of control to get control over all these rebellions and slave rebellions and peasant uprisings and indigenous revolts that were going on in the early colonial period. The whole concept of the nation state is used to control a massive amount of people. And I think that's really the danger of an identity that large.
Once you get the bureaucracy and the law, the globalized markets, it seems over, especially when the whole propaganda of the world is perpetuating that there's no alternative. And they shut down other alternatives like mutual aid. I still feel hope in the book where like they show us examples of things that have happened before. We've done it 1,000 ways before, and we can do it again. And I think that's kind of like the beauty underlying the whole argument that they have, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, that is the silver lining to like the just many, 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 many different ways of doing things. It's like just remembering that there are alternatives helps in feeling unstuck. But yeah, we got to be able to have conversations in a bigger way and encourage people to see that there are other options. There are other ways of doing things. And that's, I guess, the silver lining in the internet age too, is that like we're able to coordinate these conversations across the whole world. You can have a conversation with someone on the other side of the planet in real time about what society is, about what culture is, about how you make political choices. And that's never happened before. So we do have a unique possibility in this time period for having that kind of conversation at a global scale. The question is how to start organizing that conversation in a way that actually leads to meaningful changes. And that's like the political problem in the world right now. The one thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up and talk about how they end the chapter, they gloss a pretty famous line from Marx here on page 206, the bottom of that first full paragraph. And they're talking about the conditions under which people can make choices, whether or not there's actual freedom, whether or not you're controlled by the conditions that you're born into. And Marx has this famous line where he's like, people make their own history, but not under the conditions of their own choosing. So you do have free will or agency as individuals and as groups to make conscious political choices. But the conditions of your historical moment that you're born into, you don't get to decide. You just kind of have to work with the material that you're given. You have to play the hand you're dealt, is another way of saying that, I guess. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that line before, or if it is anything conceptually for you that's interesting that we feel like reflecting on. What are our conditions that are not of our choosing, and what are our choices that we can make in these conditions?
Yeah, I did highlight it, and I thought it kind of related back to these modes of production that they reference throughout. I guess like Marx historically thinks about like these modes of, maybe there's a slave mode where the masters have the people and the purpose is for status of the elites, and they do this non-productive mode of production, something like that. Yeah. And then, you go to like feudal land with serfdom, and maybe there's tribute and stability, and they own the land. And then like capitalism, it's all profit and accumulation in the name of capitalist versus wage labor, which I think we just talked about. And I just thought about, that like, here we are, like you're born into your circumstance, and that's like the world. You have to make it of that circumstance, and you can't choose the socioeconomical conditions that really create a lot of your life. I think that's also why it's so important to talk about these kind of things. It's like we're uncovering those socioeconomical politics of our modern life so that we can see like what's hardwired in, what's baked in, what we can project. And then we're also uncovering this history that shows us these aren't necessarily stages. They're more like tools that people have experimented with. And can we do it again? So, yeah.
I don't know if this is in the spirit of how it was meant, but I guess it made me think about when people talk about things like reparations, right? Like one of the things that people say is like, I wasn't around for that. I had no choice in what occurred or the condition the whole thing occurred. So why should I be part of that? Or why should, I pay for anything like that? But I guess that's the point of the next thing, right? So like we make our own history there. Like we can choose to like acknowledge what occurred and try to find ways to correct that, on our terms, or we can choose to not, I guess. Like it's kind of the thing there. But it made me think about that a little bit. Not sure if that's really the connection he's trying to make, but that's where my brain went.
Yeah, that's a good example. And it's just like, that's one of the choices that we get to think about in this time period. It's like there are conversations about reparations. We had this conversation with when affirmative action was white at the end, and how Ira Katznelson was kind of ambivalent about reparations at the end. But yeah, I mean, just on that particular point, it's like, I think it's helpful, first of all, to realize how massive the federal budget is, and to recognize how much active destruction of life that money goes to support, both at home and abroad. Your money is already being wasted exorbitantly on destruction and death and deprivation. And then when they have conversations about the budget, they present it in terms of scarcity. Oh, how are you going to fund that? We don't have the money to do these handout programs. We don't have the money to do this or that. The military budget's rapidly going over $1 trillion, if it hasn't already. It's right there at $1 trillion for the military budget. You can do a lot of good with that money. And reparations would only take a little bit of it. You could also end homelessness. You could also end poverty for white people. You could also do a lot of reparations for indigenous communities that are owed a lot on this continent especially. And so, yeah, these are the choices that some of the choices that we have to make. As you'd said, Arthur, that I liked a lot, in terms of the history that we're learning, that we're uncovering. You said that these are essentially tools, not stages. And I think it's really important to reject this. I think in history it's called the stadial theory of history, that history progresses through stages towards capitalism, towards agriculture. Obviously, the authors of this book are rejecting that in a big way. But I think your comment underscored that. These different modes of production, these different ways of organizing culture are tools, conceptual tools available for us to pick up or put down, to use when it makes sense, to reject when it doesn't make sense. And I think that's an important part of the conversation.
Yeah, totally. They put it on, 208. They say something like, all this suggests, historically speaking, hierarchy and equality tend to emerge together as complements to one another. And that's like, going over several cultures and stuff. And yeah, I thought like that exact thing that you're saying is like, we're all brutish, nasty, short, just killing each other. Then, then we learn to farm and holy crap. Then we get kings. Wow, how great. And then it all leads to statehood and inequality. And it's like, no, actually, all of these things are tools here and we can pick and choose them. And the choices of like freedom that we choose, I guess, like our liberties, they have to be like constantly reinforced. And that's what like capitalism is doing, I think, by these like schismogenesis fractures, like, that we talked about in these divisive ways of creating our identities and individualism. And really, like at large as a society, we should play more with these things. And Thomas Jefferson said, rewrite the Constitution every 19 years. Let's get on some of this. And how are the value systems like of the founding fathers even relevant? And most of the Supreme Court stuff that they cite is like 1800s, like, wartime law or something that they're giving rise to these current day powers. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, isn't it like a 1807 Insurrection Act thing that Trump is trying to invoke to justify sending Texas National Guard to Chicago? Like, it's crazy.
I like that. And I think this is what you were alluding to earlier, Joe, but that thought experiment of like, this is something that humans have always done. We've always had this want and to differentiate ourselves into groups and define ourselves, right, by those groups. And they found a way to enable us to do that underneath capitalism without changing the big structure. It's right, like without thinking about that. But you can root for whatever team you want and create your own individual identity as long as you're paying for it.
Yeah, I'd mentioned this in one of our early episodes because we started recording, February or March of this year or something like that. Like, I'd watched the Super Bowl not that long before we started recording our earlier conversations, but I remember bringing up in one of those conversations one of the ads in the Super Bowl that had disturbed me because it was some beer commercial and it was making fun of its users, its customers. It was making fun of sports fans in a way because it like depicted these people who were like, they were like anthropomorphized animals acting like humans basically. But we got the point. The animals in the ad were Americans in everyday life. And they were these really enthusiastic sports fans. They were getting drunk and everything. And then they were just exhausted and tired and they had to go to work on Monday. And this ad was just making fun of the fact you can enjoy your play freedom on Super Bowl Sunday and enjoy your sports teams, but all you losers got to show up for us and work your ass off on Monday. And I just thought it was such a cold and sinister ad in that way. And what you were just saying reminded me of it. Because like, yeah, you can enjoy all these play freedoms, but when it comes to actually changing the way that society operates, changing the resources and the way they're distributed, no, you don't get freedoms in that way. You do what we tell you to do. Well, this last paragraph, really, of the chapter, we're talking about these huge societies, these huge cultural questions, what large groups of people do, and then they point back to the smallest possible unit for where to look. So it sort of points right back to the family, to the domestic sphere. They say, as our story continues, we will encounter this dynamic repeatedly. We might refer to it perhaps as inequality from below. Domination first appears on the most intimate domestic level. Self-consciously egalitarian politics emerge to prevent such relations from extending beyond those small worlds into the public sphere, which often comes to be imagined in the process as an exclusive sphere for adult men. These are the kind of dynamics that culminated in phenomena like ancient Athenian democracy, but their roots probably extend much further back in time to well before the advent of farming and agricultural societies. So when it comes to the modern day and like questions of like fascism versus, anti-fascism, not to call myself a terrorist, but I'm more on the anti-fascist side of that equation. How is your family life? How is your life at home? For every fascist, I want a camera inside their home to see how they treat the people in their home. And I think what they're suggesting here at the end of this chapter just sort of pointed back to the reality that, like I said before, fractals. I think in fractal patterns, what's true on the most intimate, tiny individual level can be extrapolated to a larger cultural level if you're looking at it that way. So the way people act in their own domestic family unit says a lot about how they view politics writ large in the world. What do you guys think about that connection between the domestic and the cultural in that way?
Yeah, I love that. It's like it reminded me of some Foucault Discipline and Punish talks about like the microphysics of power, where it's not like the large systems of power that control us necessarily at first. It's really, yeah, these like small, normalized teachings of like obedience and gesture, normalizing hierarchy and shaping like bodies and behavior. And he talks about like the classroom and even yeah, like the parent, the priest, and like a social worker, are all forms of like this, like, yeah, instilling this, I guess, body of inequality and obedience and control and submission into the lives that we have. Comes from like, yeah, like these, it's taught in schools and in family units. And so yeah, it's like down to the core. It's really embedded. It's so pretty scary there. And maybe like if the point of the chapter is one of the main points of the book is like experiment with these tools and stuff. And if it is coming from the family or wherever, at first, like maybe it's like a call to experiment with that. Like, why are we having these passed down values and just regurgitating them rather than like what actually works and what creates happiness and healthiness above all?
I guess like for me, Joe, when you're talking about that, is to like inherently made sense to me, I guess. And it made me think about, I think we talked about this in our early fascism episodes, but just how like the promise in Germany was like a lot of the young men in Germany on board is like, Hitler's going to be the father of the country and whatever he says goes, and you are the king of your domicile, right? And the family honors you, right? Like it just made me think about that kind of comparison and play there. But I don't know if I've got anything else to add, but other than, is it just like family trauma, like on a grand scale?
Well, that's super interesting about like the German one, and like, yeah, daddy's going to discipline you. He's the leader. That's, really interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what do we call those guys who started this country? Just randomly. What do we
Totally. Founding daddies.
But yeah, like a lot of this Howard Zinn stuff at the beginning of the U.S. history has to do with the intimate oppression of women, of like how half of the human population in this country were completely repressed, completely unfree, had no ownership, had no choice, had no nothing. And this parenthetical they have in the paragraph about how the public sphere comes to be seen as the exclusive sphere for adult men. Like, that was the founding of our country. Land-owning, property-owning white men could vote, nobody else. And it is a direct reflection of how the domestic life is structured, right? I think there's a parallel there. So yeah, not to make it too personal for anyone listening, but how you organize your life at home says a lot about how you view politics and how humans should be organized writ large. And it's, I don't know, these things are related. So being very self-conscious and ethical, non-harming in the way we structure our personal lives, to be very conscious about the way oppression works on a large scale and how it works on a local, domestic, intimate scale. These things are deeply interconnected, I think. But yeah.
It's really interesting too, like talking about this as like a summation and looking back at the social death and the homo soccer idea. And what you're bringing up here is how in culture we have identified these groups that don't belong to like, the living. And it has been, at first, it was, I guess, indigenous people in these lands because we needed the land. And then it turns into like, Black people who become slaves, and then it turns into women, and and then slowly we have allowed, I'll say whatever, these people to be in this like biopower of like the living group, and how that story is kind of like getting to like, it's like a social evolution. And now it's like maybe children used to be labor, and now it's, go against pedophiles, which is, I think, great, have some laws there. But it's just really interesting how the sense of belonging has shifted and how we've normalized that. But they're also just tools, and like it could have been that way the whole time. We could always have had I don't know. It's just really interesting.
It makes sense too. It just made me think about how it's important to have hope, and we should get hope where we can get it. But there are misleading ways to give hope. Like I think about, I don't know, I've never double checked the accuracy of the quote, but it's often attributed to MLK Jr. that the arc of history bends toward justice. And I think even though that's a hopeful thing to think about, I don't think that's an accurate thing to think about. I think things that are given can be taken away if you let them be taken away. So like you're saying, Arthur, these are tools. There are good tools, there are bad tools, there are oppressive tools, there are egalitarian tools. We have to be very conscious about the conceptual tools we apply to our societies. But yeah, I recognize and affirm all those inclusions that you were listing about how things have changed over the years. Because we're doing so much conversation about like what culture and society is like now versus often comparing it to different indigenous groups in the past, with North American indigenous groups, it was obvious to early settlers that they had a very different way of dealing with children in the sense that children were essentially free. They weren't disciplined, they weren't punished, they could do whatever they wanted basically, and it was the community's and the tribe's responsibility to raise them and give them good examples and stuff. But you didn't have, like the settlers did, this very strict, authoritative, overbearing parental presence that a lot of the European people were bringing over. So just the way we treat children, I think children in general are massively oppressed as a group in a lot of ways. So yeah, something to think about. Any final thoughts on this chapter?
Just overall, like I knew nothing about West Coast indigenous tribes or any, like really anything about that. I guess I'd like think more
Me too.
East Coast and Central and whatnot. So that I enjoyed learning just about that in general. It was cool. I love that they're highlighting all the ways that people lived, right? It's clear that this isn't a book about like, oh, look, these tribes were super egalitarian and that's the way we should live. No, it's like people lived a lot of ways. like there was still slavery and aristocracy and inequality, but we can, I think the underlying theme that I continue to come back to this is we can choose not to. We can choose not to. Like,
Yeah, same. I've loved, I don't like it. It was a lot of like, Oregon Coast, like, I read up on the Chetco and the Wogies myth a little bit more, and it was like this area near like Brookings and Gold Beach that I used to go to. So it was just kind of cool, yeah, being like having more local-ish, history here before the white colonizers, and the myth of the Wogies becoming those, later become like they believe the white colonizers were the Wogies returned. And so it was just kind of cool. Always fun to read local stuff. And then, yeah, same thing about hope, experiment with the tools that we have.
Yeah, I appreciate learning about some of this older stuff that predates U.S. history, especially the indigenous stuff, because I don't know, it's a joke in Parks and Rec that history began on 1775 or whatever with Ron Swanson's character. But it is kind of true culturally that a lot of people view this continent's history that way, that there's not a lot of appreciation for the human activity that has been going on for thousands and thousands of years on this continent. Not just all over the world, but on this continent for many, many thousands of years. I think historically it just gives us an appreciation for how much human history is on this land. Like you were saying, you went to those beaches as a kid that you're learning about in the book, and I'm right here near the Potomac River. And there's a lot of indigenous history on the Potomac before that river was completely polluted with agricultural runoff. It's nice and inspiring to connect to a deeper history with the land, especially, as us inheritors of colonizers are finding new ways to think about ourselves. But speaking of agriculture, that's where the next chapter is going to be headed. So if you want to learn more about the origin of farming and the history of agriculture, the alleged beginning of civilization, although I'm assuming that's going to get upended in this chapter. Stay tuned and join us next time for Chapter 6, For the Dawn of Everything. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.